Welcome to Museum on the Move, and today you join us here at Peel Castle on St Patrick's Isle. Now, St Patrick's Isle is connected today to the main Isle of Man by a road bridge or a causeway, but for most of its history it's been quite separate, a protected little islet. Now, Peel Castle is one of the most complicated historic sites in the British Isles. Within its magnificent curtain walls there are many layers of Manx history. This site pretty much encompasses the entire human history of the Isle of Man. So let's go and find out a little bit more about it.
Peel Castle, as you now see it, is made up of the remains of lots of different buildings from many different periods of time. The oldest standing ruins we can now see are St Patrick's Church and the Round Tower. The oldest parts of these buildings may be nearly 1,000 years old or even older. They possibly replaced an older monastic community. Another impressive building within Peel Castle is St Germans Cathedral. Building work on the cathedral began at the beginning of the 1200s and was speeded up after St Patrick's Isle was gifted to the church by King Magnus. One of the most striking features of the site today is this magnificent curtain wall that surrounds St Patrick's Isle. The curtain wall itself seems to have been constructed first in red sandstone in the area most vulnerable to attack, which is the area facing Peel Bay, with the rest being completed in Manx slate at a later date.
Now, one of the reasons we know so much about the history of Peel Castle is that it's been excavated a number of times by archaeologists. The biggest dig that's ever taken place on St Patrick's Isle took place in the 1980s, and today we're going to talk about that with our archaeologist at Manx National Heritage, Andy Johnson, and he's going to talk to us particularly about a Viking age grave that was found on this site, and it was really significant. Welcome to Museum on the Move, Andy.
Hi, Katie.
It's lovely to see you at Peel Castle.
Thank you.
Now, you actually worked on that dig in the 1980s, and
I did, yeah.
I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that, and also a little bit about how you knew where to dig, because it's a pretty big island, really.
It is, and we've only dug an absolute tiny proportion of it. We had a very particular goal. We were charged with the idea of investigating the buildings on the north side of the cathedral, which is we're looking at those now, and also to investigate the immediate vicinity, particularly this very steeply sloped bank that we're on top of. In this particular area, we were suspicious of the sort of shape of the ground, and also it's a traditional place on the north side of churches to find a burial ground. So with the cathedral just to the south of us, it was an obvious place to investigate. In total, in the course of the 7 years that we were here, we excavated something just over 300 graves. With it being a Christian site, a church site, the majority of the graves in the cemetery were quite obviously Christian. They were orientated east-west, as you still tend to find today. And they were very simple burials with no grave goods. We started to find just a small number of graves that actually had grave goods, actually had artifacts buried in them, and that's a sign really of people who aren't, if they are Christian, then they're hedging their bets. They're both Christian and perhaps a little bit of pagan.
So in this particular trench, what did you find that was so very significant? You've alluded to grave goods, but what sort of objects were found?
Well, once we actually got inside the grave, the first thing that was apparent was an iron rod. Didn't look especially special. It was sort of rusty, and it was down one side of the body, and you know, the rumour mill started instantly around the site that or perhaps it was a bishop's crozier, or perhaps it was a weaving sword, something like that. And eventually the suggestion was, well, maybe it's something domestic, like a cooking spit, and that really was the sort of the working hypothesis whilst we were on site, and it was becoming apparent that we were dealing with a female grave, and you know, those things seemed to be adding up. We had two knives, one of them with a lovely sort of hilt that was decorated with silver wire. There were a pair of shears for cutting cloth or shearing sheep. There was a bone comb. Those are things that you find in many Viking graves. There were also some unusual things. There was a little kind of organic work pouch that may have been for needlework or something. It had two bronze pins in it. There was a very strange thing that looked almost, it was two stones, one of them a tiny little sort of cup. I mean, we're talking something about this big. It was sort of cup shaped, it had a hole in the bottom, and there was, right next to it, there was a tiny little stone that was a sort of stone rod, and it almost looked like a miniature pestle and mortar. And then the sort of the pièce de résistance in terms of bling was this amazing necklace of glass, jet and amber beads, and that was just, we couldn't believe it, because you know, when you spend your time working in what's basically dirt, to find something that's so shiny and so perfect and so colourful as coloured glass is it's beyond your wildest dreams. At the time, it was immensely significant. At the time, the sort of hypotheses that came out of that were based on, I would say, quite traditional approaches to interpreting these kinds of graves. So, for instance, there was no sign of the sort of classic Scandinavian sort of pieces of women's costume jewellery, like the tortoise brooches that you get here, which were used basically to pin together a kind of apron that went over their dress, and on that basis it was suggested that this woman had been local, and that she had married an incoming Scandinavian, and that was why her that seemed all to explain quite neatly why it was that she had artifacts that picked her out as being pagan, but she was buried in a Christian cemetery. That's been turned on its head by some of the science that we're able to use now. The other thing, the other exciting thing from a science perspective, aside from, you know, those sort of chemical analyses of the glass beads, was the chemistry that we're able to bring to the actual physical remains of these skeletons. The analyses that were undertaken about 7 years ago now, I think, that shows that far from being this local girl who marries the incoming Viking strongman kind of thing, which is all terribly sort of patriarchal, instead this was someone who, like those incoming men, was also a traveller from elsewhere, and along with a number of other similar studies that have been undertaken, we are seeing a much more cosmopolitan population on the island through both slightly before the Vikings arrived here, and then during their time and into the later centuries.
What an exciting project to work on.
It was amazing.
Then and still now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I come in this castle, you know, and every time I ruminate about what we've done in the past, and also what opportunities it still offers.
We had an absolutely fantastic time at Peel Castle, so we've come to the Manx Museum to see some of the artefacts that Andy was talking to us about.
And remember that you can learn more about the Pagan Lady by visiting our website and looking at our learning pages.
So we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye!